Okay, so today we're going to continue, at least in part, our discussion of plural marriage, and containing with a little bit of history that's going on for the church as it moves out west, but especially to talk about, plural marriage is instituted. Hopefully you've all read the plural marriage essays as you were assigned to, so please make sure you've read those. In fact, this will make more sense to you if you've already read them. But of course, plural marriage is going to be a problem for the church vis-a-vis the American government, really for the remainder of the 19th century and on into the 20th century, actually. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The church is going to move, as you can see over here on this map, the church is going to move from Illinois and then temporarily stop in Iowa in Winter Quarters and in Council Bluffs, where they'll prepare for the trek west. Once they get out to the Western Territories, Utah Territory is going to be established as part of the Compromise of 1850. You can see that there is Utah Territory. And there the Mormons are going to be, for a short time, be able to begin practicing their religion without fear of mob violence. They're able to teach openly about things like the plurality of gods, that the Trinity is not correct as a doctrine, and that the practice of plural marriage is something that it's going to catch the ire certainly of many people in the United States. For a brief time, they were okay politically because these territories out in the West, they were disputed. The Compromise of 1850 had allowed slavery into these territories, and so it wasn't just an easy yes or no, are these places going to be slavery or not slavery? It was something that was going to be determined later. And in a way, both the Whigs, which was the major party at the time, and the Democrats, they were kind of vying for control of these territories. And so in the first part of the 1850s, the Mormons actually had some national hopes of being able to be admitted as a state. They wanted to be the state of Deseret, or the state of Utah is what it ends up being. But when the Whig Party collapses, the party that comes to power to take the place of the Whig Party is the Republican Party. The Democratic Party, you can trace it all the way to the Democratic Party today. I'm not saying they believe the same things. In fact, there are many things they don't believe the same. Similar with the Republicans. The Republican Party is founded in the mid-1850s, and unlike the Whig Party, that had really tried hard to be a national party, that had tried, Zachary Taylor was the president, who was a Whig president. Well, he was a slave owner from Louisiana. So even though most Whig support came from the North, there were many Whigs in the South. Similarly, even though most Democratic support came from the South, there were many millions of Democrats in the North. They were both national parties. But the Republican Party was a sectional party, meaning it only even attempted to appeal to essentially the northern states. And from the beginning, it was, at least in part, an anti-Mormon party. Their first presidential platform that they put up was to rid the territories of the two twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. Now, why did they lump the two together? Well, in part, it's because most Americans felt pretty ambivalent about slavery. Ambivalent meaning, in the North, most Americans were not abolitionists. Most didn't have an undying moral hatred for slavery. Most of them would rather not see slavery expand, but they certainly weren't willing to fight and die over it. I mean, it was important, but not that important. In some ways, it's kind of like, it's really hard to find something that would be comparison to, but if someone were to make the general statement to you as students, were to say, we would like the campus of Brigham Young University to be more green. Do you support us in our green initiative to make it more green? Most of you, outside of some of you, diehard conservatives who are just going to say, absolutely not. I don't believe in green. I believe in actually trying to make things blue. No conservative really is like that. But I'm just saying, almost all of you would agree with that statement. You'd say, yes, I think the campus should be more green. That sounds great. But when the next line of that letter or announcement was, and to facilitate a more green campus, we're going to double the tuition rates of every student. suddenly I'm not as in favor of a green campus as I once was, right? So in general, yes, you are okay with the idea of, having more solar panels on campus. But if it was going to double your tuition, you'd feel a lot more uncomfortable with it, right? It's not a very good analogy because obviously most people are far more passionate about slavery in the 19th century than many people are about green energy today. But what I'm trying to get at is that most people in the North are not diehard abolitionists. Most of them are opposed to slavery on economic or political or social grounds, and very few of them are opposed on moral grounds or religious grounds. The Republican Party from its outset has a very strong evangelical Christian component to it that is going to state that slavery is wrong in the eyes of God. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is going to say, if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. So, as a Mormon, you want to look back on that era and you want to say, yeah, if I lived back then, I'd be opposed to slavery, I'd be a Republican. That's what you want to say, right? The problem is, the same thing that made a Republican in the 19th century hate slavery is the same thing that made them hate Mormonism. Because Mormonism was a sin in the eyes of God, the same way slavery was a sin in the eyes of God. You might have had this experience talking to a friend of yours who's an evangelical Christian today. And you'll find you start talking about socialism. You're like, well, what do you believe about abortion? Well, we're opposed to abortion. We think it's wrong in the eyes of God. A Mormon says, yeah, us too. You talk to him, well, what do you think about euthanasia, about people ending their own life? Well, our church is opposed. Oh, ours is too. Well, what do you think about gay marriage? Well, we believe that marriage is only between a man and a woman in the eyes of God. And you find you have all of these similar beliefs as this evangelical Christian friend, but they still think you're on your way to burn in hell. That's because the same thing that makes them despise abortion, for instance, is the same thing that makes them have a problem with Mormonism. They believe abortion is a sin in the eyes of God, and so is worshiping the wrong Jesus is a sin in the eyes of God, which is what Mormons are doing, right? And so this, early on, the Republican Party is very antagonistic. The Whig Party had some of this, but the Republican Party is going to really carry this through. I mean, my favorite attempt of the federal government to limit Mormonism's influence and its spread was in the 1850s. There was a proposal before Congress to purchase tens of thousands of copies of the Book of Mormon, with the idea being that the only reason why anyone's becoming a Mormon is they just have no idea what's actually in the book. If they knew it was in the book, then no one would ever be a Mormon ever again. I'm sure that the church would have been like, no, please don't purchase tens of thousands of copies of the Book of Mormon and distribute it everywhere. But in the end, they decided not to do it, not because it wasn't right to try to destroy a religion, which is what you'd like to believe, but because they decided it would cost too much. And the only people printing the Book of Mormon are all those Mormons, so we'd have to give them money. So there are multiple anti-polygamy laws that are proposed during the 1850s on the lead up to the Civil War. But none of them are passed. They aren't passed because Democrats, especially in the South, from these slave states, they aren't Mormon lovers at all, as Missouri can testify to that effect, right? But they don't want to set a precedent. If the federal government has the right to outlaw polygamy in the territories, then wouldn't the federal government have the right to outlaw slavery in the territories? So they don't want to set the precedent of the federal government having a right to regulate what they call the domestic institution of marriage. And so the Mormons are really in a tough spot. They're trying to be admitted to the Union as a state, but there's all kinds of opposition primarily on this religious grounds. And polygamy is certainly the lightning rod. Look, obviously there's persecution of Mormons long before they're practicing polygamy, right? There are dozens of men murdered and men and women assaulted in Missouri before there's even an inkling of plural marriage, right? It's just that after plural marriage starts to be practiced, it is the easiest way to win the argument, right? Well, you aren't really Christians. Yes, we are. Don't you practice polygamy? And boom, you win the argument. And so the the practice of plural marriage is going to really, it's going to be the way that the church is primarily criticized going forward. Before it was the Book of Mormon, it was the radical doctrines of Mormonism, but now they can make it much more about the plural marriage, and that's why the Republicans try to join the two. Slavery, people are pretty ambivalent about, but no one's ambivalent about plural marriage. In fact, the Republicans would attack the Democrats in Congress over and over again. These people love slavery so much that they're even willing to vote against a polygamy bill. Honestly, you find that same kind of rhetoric today, or at least you did, when the debates about whether or not gay marriage should be legalized nationally before the Supreme Court ruled on it. You would find many, especially religious conservatives, who would say, you know, the problem with gay marriage is if you legalize gay marriage, the next thing you'll know will have polygamy legal. And so notice what they're saying there, that somehow polygamy is actually worse. It's a step down from gay marriage, which demonstrates that in America, monogamy is so central to our cultural values that it's actually even more important than heterosexual marriage, right? Monogamy has to be two people, right? And so religious conservatives say, well, if you allow gay marriage, which they know many people could go either way on, then you'll end up having plural marriage, which they know almost no one's okay with. Even people who are advocates of gay marriage are totally opposed to plural marriage in America today, the vast majority of them. And so the Republicans are trying to equate slavery and plural marriage together as well. The same way that you hate plural marriage and think that it's a sin, that's what slavery is, right? So this is a pretty difficult political climate. This gives you an idea of just how far the Republican Party went with this. Many of you have heard of the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was designed to give land away in the West and had lots of reasons that it was being proposed, but here's an example of one of them. One of the sponsors of the bill, Representative Stephen Foster from Maine, you can read from the title of the speech, "The Republican Land Policy, Homes for the Million. Give the public lands to the people and you settle the slavery question. Obliterate the frontiers, dispense with the standing army, and extinguish Mormonism." So part of the reason why they're proposing the Homestead Act is to extinguish Mormonism. In fact, as Foster writes in there, we will crush Mormonism underneath the advancing tread of Christian civilization. Some pretty powerful words. When the Civil War actually does come, of course, Utah Territory remains loyal to the Union. And in fact, you get this very odd experience where the Mormons are trying to become a state. They're trying to get Utah admitted to the Union as a state. All the while, these 11 states have all left the Union and are actually taking up arms, and the war is going on. But now, since most Democrats were in the South and almost all Republicans were in the North, once the Democrats secede and form the Confederate States of America, there's no one any longer blocking these anti-Mormon Republican-sponsored bills. And so it's actually during the Civil War that you get the beginnings of the federal anti-Mormon legislation. For instance, in July of 1862, you have the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act. Morrill as in Morrill. Justin Morrill is a senator from Vermont who sponsors it. Not moral like immoral, although I'm sure Justin Morrill would be very fine if he said that polygamy was immoral. And it makes polygamy for the first time illegal in the territories of the United States. Up to this point, the arguments about plural marriage that had really bothered people, the arguments that you read about in the Seer that Orson Pratt was trying to respond to, up to that point, it was all just rhetoric. It was, well, you're wrong to believe that. After 1862, the rhetoric changes a great deal because now it's actually illegal. Now it is against the law. And so the arguments against Mormons become so much more easier to make because you say to a Mormon, well, you're disloyal. And they say, well, no, I'm not. And the response is, are you practicing polygamy? Are you a member of a church that legalizes polygamy? That's against the law in the United States. So therefore, you are not a good and loyal citizen. In fact, during the Civil War, Utah is occupied by this clown and a half. His name's Patrick Connor. I usually tell my students that at some point when I'm retired from BYU, I'm going to write a biography of Patrick Connor. I can't write it till I'm retired from BYU because I want the title to be a pretty rough one. Patrick Connor comes with the California Volunteers and occupies Utah. So even though Utah has stated that it's loyal to the Union, has sent troops to help guard the mail route in 1862, the Republicans just don't believe that the Mormons are good American citizens because they have this false religion that they're practicing. And when Connor occupies Utah territory, he asks multiple times for the green light to just start killing him some Mormons. Luckily, his commanding officer never grants him that ability. But not to be outdone, Patrick Connor will go find some people to murder. In 1863, upon a report that some Shoshone Indians had attacked a group of non-Mormon miners on their way to Montana, he marched his army out up to what is now southern Idaho and attacked the winter encampment of the Shoshone there at Bear River and massacred 400 primarily women and children. And it's horrific. I mean, his men murder and according to the Mormon who came later on the scene the next day, said that it was obvious that many of the women had been sexually assaulted before they were murdered. There were accounts of babies having their heads smashed against rocks. I mean, just horrific things. Many of his soldiers cut off fingers and hands and toes of the people they murdered and wore them as necklaces back to Salt Lake. I mean, Patrick Connor is a horrible murderer. And the Bear River Massacre is the worst Indian massacre in American history west of the Mississippi. And most people don't even know that it happened. Connor's, in fact, given a promotion for it. So it is a dark time. Native Americans are really big losers of the American Civil War because the same consolidating power that brings the nation together and creates this powerful military is then used to force Indians into subjugation. And in this case, just with horrendous, murderous results. So Patrick Connor, not my fan. He's the one occupying Utah, and he sees Mormons as traitors and enemies to the Union. And he wants to have the ability to destroy them. Thank heavens. His superior, Irvin McDowell, never allows it to happen. But it is a trying time for Mormons. So if you ever read the journals of Brigham Young or Wilford Woodruff during the 1860s, as a Mormon, what you want to read is that they're so excited about the Union fighting against the South. I mean, you want to because you're a patriotic Mormon today. Just believe that Mormons during the Civil War were gung-ho in favor of, ending slavery. And the reality is the Mormons weren't really gung-ho. They certainly weren't on the side of the South. But it was hard to be 100% behind the government that was already passing legislation to destroy your religion. See, in 1862... they passed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, outlawing a part of the Mormon religion, the practice of plural marriage. At the same time, they passed that Homestead Act, which was designed to destroy Mormonism, as you read, to extinguish Mormonism. And then after the Civil War, the government passed a series of laws strengthening anti-polygamy laws and trying to take away power from Mormons living in the state. I don't have them all listed here, but two of the other really important ones are the Edmunds Act and the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which do a lot of things. I mean, one of the issues out in Utah territory was that the Mormons were the earliest group of people to allow women the right to vote in the United States. And so you notice how contradictory the argument is, right? So people in the East are saying, well, you Mormons are abusing these women. Polygamy is a horrific experience. No woman would ever willingly want to be a part of Mormonism. They're all duped or tricked, or their minds are. And so it was harder to make that argument for people in the East when Mormon women started getting civil rights long before women in the rest of the United States did. For instance, women in Utah are voting in 1870. Women in the rest of the country aren't going to be voting until 1920. So that's half of a century later. Now, there will be other parts where they get the right to vote, but they're first given the right to vote in Wyoming. There's almost no one living in Wyoming. But they first actually exercise the right to vote in Utah territory. The problem is these Mormon women, instead of voting out all the polygamists, they vote for them. They vote in support of their church leaders. And so the federal government, one of the things it does with the Edmunds Act is it strips women of the right to vote. Imagine that. We often think of society being this progression towards giving more rights to disenfranchised groups. Here's the opposite. In 1870, women have the right to vote in Utah. And in 12 years later, that right to vote is taken away from them by the federal government because they weren't exercising their right to vote the right way, because they were voting for polygamists and for other Mormons. I mean, how could they possibly do that? Women in Utah had the right to divorce much earlier than other states and municipalities. One of the safeguards that Brigham Young instituted on plural marriage, right? Because the fear is, what if a woman's trapped in this plural marriage that she can't get out of, and it's horrible? Well, women in plural marriages had the right to get a divorce for essentially no cause. And if they asked for a divorce, the husband had to then pay child support and alimony for them. So a woman could leave a plural marriage at any time she wanted to. Contrarily, a man could not. A man was not allowed to divorce one of his plural wives unless she left the church or committed adultery. And so that was kind of one of the safeguards that was built in, is that, if a woman felt like she was being mistreated as the second or the third wife, she could leave, get a divorce, and the husband would be required to pay for both, not only her sustenance, but also for her children's. And so that was one of the safeguards put in place. And there's not repercussions for this. I mean, a great example is Miranda Hyde. Miranda Hyde is the wife of Orson Hyde, the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. So there's Brigham Young, and then there's Orson Hyde, president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And she divorces him once she gets out to Utah, and the laws allow it. And there's no repercussions for her at all. She stays a faithful member of the church and serves in various callings. I mean, so one of the aspects of plural marriage that, of course, is very understood is this idea that people are being forced into this. The number that sometimes was bandied about that, fewer than 2% of people practice plural marriage. Well, that's obviously, you read from the essays, that's not accurate. Anywhere between 25 to 40% of families in Utah were in some way plural families. But it still was never the majority, right? Sometimes people say things like, but it was believed that you had to practice plural marriage to go to heaven. We have multiple accounts of Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, others explaining, no, you don't have to practice plural marriage to go to the celestial kingdom. You have to accept the doctrine. You have to accept that Joseph Smith is a prophet and that he taught it. But in fact, there was an apostle speaking once about it and kind of overstepped his bounds and said, yes, everyone who wants to go to the celestial kingdom should practice plural marriage. And Brigham Young got up after him and stopped him and said, no, you can go to the celestial kingdom as long as you are in any sealed marriage. You don't have to practice plural marriage. So there were people that, again, they made sacrifices and by choice were in these marriages. But the federal government is going to try to stop that. After it was made illegal, Mormons couldn't simply just instead of getting another marriage certificate, they started practicing plural marriage the same way they did in Nauvoo. I mean, in Illinois, they weren't just going and getting marriage certificates from the local clerk of courts over and over again. They were simply married to one person legally, as far as the United States was concerned, and then they were marrying other wives in temple ceremonies. And they were doing the same thing in Utah Territory. Once it was made illegal, you would be married legally to one woman, and then you would be sealed to these other wives in temple ceremonies. And then, they would each have a separate residence, but they would be your plural wife, your plural wives if you were a man, or you'd be in this plural family if you were a woman. So the government actually changed the laws. They changed the laws to make them anti-cohabitation laws, making it illegal for a man to ever be in the same household as a woman that he's not married to legally. And that's how they made most of the anti-polygamy arrests. In fact, today, in America today, most anti-polygamy arrests are made in the same fashion. They are made through anti-cohabitation laws. I mean, obviously, with some of the more radical groups, there are some arrests that are made on child abuse laws, right? Because they're girls that are married before the age of consent in some of these states. But many of the laws, you might even remember, some of you, if you know Sister Wives show that's been on TV for a while. They're not Mormons, right? They're from an offshoot branch of an offshoot branch of an offshoot branch of Mormonism, right? But it is funny, though, if you ever watch the show, they'll have like the proclamation of the family, like, hanging in their front room. But the reason why they moved out of Utah was initiating proceedings to have them arrested and tried under anti-cohabitation laws. So they passed these laws, which essentially made it illegal for anyone who wasn't married to ever be in the same household as someone else of the opposite sex. But then they only enforced those laws against Mormons. And we can actually even have a good example of this. It kind of gives you an idea of how hated Mormonism was in the 19th century. This is a pretty standard cartoon, actually. You can see it, right? Uncle Sam walking on bayoneted guns on the way out to the tabernacle, which is listed as the Mormon vermin nest. And the Mormons are portrayed as a bunch of vipers and snakes with the heading, "The Only Sure Way." Mormons are depicted as worms. They're depicted as rats. They're depicted as snakes. I mean, there's a great dehumanizing element. And there's just this manifest hatred of the country of Mormonism. Mormonism is embarrassing to them, especially because Mormons, most hatred in the country, you're able to classify along racial or ethnic lines. And Mormons are a real problem because they appear to be just as white as your average American, right? Many of them have stock, and those that are foreign, most of them are from northern Germany, Denmark, or England, from the properly white countries, and yet their religion makes them so castigated from society that you really have to demonstrate this is what a fallen white person looks like, right? They're a Mormon. This document here kind of gives you an understanding of how these laws were applied. Shows you some of the arrests that were made and how long these people were in incarceration. One of my favorite ones is, if you look down the screen a little ways, right down here to Dr. J.B. Carrington, okay? He's arrested. Now notice his charge is for bigamy rather than unlawful cohabitation. Well, that means that he literally had 2 wives. He literally had 2 marriage certificates in the territory of Utah. Well, what finds out? Well, first of all, his bail set at $2,500. That's a huge amount of money. Remember, most people are making less than $500 a year. In today's terms, that would be like a bail of like $250,000, right? Maybe $300,000. That's a huge bail for bigamy. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal. But wait a minute, his case is dismissed. Why is it dismissed? Because he's a Gentile bigamist. See, the laws were so designed to hurt Mormons and Mormonism that even when they found someone who actually was practicing polygamy, but they weren't practicing it religiously, they didn't actually file cases against them. It shows that these are absolutely deliberately anti-Mormon laws. And it's not just men who go to jail over anti-polygamy laws. Here you can see Lydia Spencer. Why are women going to jail for this? Well, because they're going to jail primarily for contempt of court. Notice she's going for contempt of court. Why? Until she answers. You can see this happen to Lucy Devereaux, Elizabeth Ann Harkey, right? Eliza Schaefer. There are dozens, hundreds of women who are going to go to jail for the fact that they won't testify against their husbands. And, normally in America's jurisprudence, you can't be compelled to testify against your spouse, right? This kind of privilege between you and your wife, you can if you want, but you can't be compelled by the state to testify against your husband or wife. But the state responded, you aren't in legal marriages. So technically, he isn't really your husband, so that privilege doesn't actually apply to you. You are forced to testify, and when they wouldn't, they'd be thrown in jail for contempt, sometimes for months at a time. It was a devastating time for the church. Men and women had to live in hiding, and all demonstrating how committed they were to living what God had commanded them to do. They weren't willing to allow the government to determine how their religion would be lived. And so for decades, this was going on. By 1887, if we go back a little bit, you can remember the Edmunds-Tucker Act. it really puts the screws to the whole church, because the church continues to try to live what they believe God has commanded them to live. And the more they try to live it, the more frustrated the government becomes. In 1887, with the Edmunds-Tucker Act, not only have women been disenfranchised, they then disincorporate the entire church. They essentially make the church no longer an entity, so it can no longer legally hold property or collect tithing or anything. They confiscate all church lands in excess of a certain amount of money, but then they're the ones who decide how much money it is, so they basically confiscate all church lands. And they force the church to pay rent to use its own church houses and temples to the federal government. And so they are at a time where the church has been essentially completely annihilated, at least as far as the federal government is concerned. John Taylor ended his life living in hiding as they were trying to try them. And it's at this point that Wilford Woodruff, I mean, you get a sense of what he's feeling in 1889. So just before the manifesto is issued, the official proclamation, he talks about 1888. It's past and gone, it's born a report of heaven of all men. What 1889 will bring to pass must determine. Darkness covers the earth, and gross darkness the people, and warfare of priest and people is still against the church and the kingdom of God on earth. There's an exertion made in Washington to get Utah admitted into the Union as a state with other territories, but there is a strong opposition to it by our enemies. Wilford Woodruff, if you read his journal again and again and again, he is ready to continue to defend this as a doctrine revealed by God as long as it takes. There are plans made for the church to, if it has to, flee to the territories in Mexico or even to Canada, but they're going to do what God commands them to do regardless. But instead, later that year, Wilford Woodruff is going to receive the revelation that ends plural marriage, Official Declaration 1. And you can read that heading that's now in the 2013 edition of the Scriptures. You can read the little bit of the background to it. This is what he writes in his journal. I've arrived at the point of the history of my life as the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where I'm under the necessity of acting for the temporal salvation of the church. The United States government has taken a stand and passed laws to destroy the Latter-day Saints upon the subject of polygamy or the patriarchal order of marriage. And after praying to the Lord and feeling inspired by His Spirit, I have issued the following proclamation, which is sustained by my counselors and the 12 apostles. And you have the official declaration that follows. You also have in your scriptures, this explanation of this revelation that Wilford gives, explaining that he had a vision of no one being able to be married in the temple anymore. All temple work being stopped because of this. So they did not. It's the hardest thing for us today in the 21st century to understand that they did not cry out and rejoice that plural marriage was ended. Remember, it's been a generation that's been raised with it. It was the defining characteristic. Everyone hates you over polygamy, but you still know that it's a true doctrine of God. And so there were many men and women who had a really difficult time accepting that God gave this revelation. And some broke off and formed other churches. That's where the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints comes from. The Apostolic United Brethren, that's where they come from. They come from people who are unwilling to believe that God would give further continuing revelation to end the practice of plural marriage. Now, one of the great misunderstandings about the manifesto is that many people believe that this ended plural marriage in the church. You'll even hear people say things like, and usually we say it like super defensively, by the way. Someone will say to you, oh, you Mormons, you still practice polygamy, and we get really defensive. We say, we haven't even practiced that since 1890 for 120 years, right? We get really angry, right? But the reality is actually Mormons in good standing, in full faith and fellowship, continue to practice plural marriage well into the 20th century. The manifesto ended, the official declaration, it ended plural marriage in the United States, and it new plural marriages. But if you had been married prior to that, the manifesto being issued, you stayed in your plural marriage. You did not have to end your plural marriage. And that was kind of the agreement that the federal government kind of worked out, saying, okay, fine, we'll stop prosecuting, at least heavily, the plural marriage cases if you make sure there aren't any more plural marriages. And then it'll just die out. But, for instance, Joseph F. Smith, who's our prophet during the early 20th century, he has 3 wives. And when he's asked before Congress why he hasn't stopped practicing plural marriage, his response is, I refuse to abandon the wives of my youth. During this time of great persecution, for many members of the church, it was the great deciding factor of whether or not you're going to be faithful in the face of this persecution. And there certainly are those who are not. Let's read Official Declaration 1. Plural marriage is going to continue in the church as far as people living in plural marriages well into the 20th century. In the 1940s and 50s, there are very few people who have a hard time with plural marriage because almost all of them have a grandfather or sometimes even a parent who themselves have been living in a plural marriage relationship. It's only in the 1980s and 90s, as we get further away and we get several generations removed from it, that it becomes such a foreign concept and we get re-immersed in American culture at large that causes us to have a big problem with it, a much harder problem with it, because it's foreign to us, right? I mean, it's hard to argue that polygamy is a horrible, wicked, evil thing if grandma's in a polygamous marriage and she's telling you that that she was called by God to do it, right? So personal contact kind of changes that understanding. Once you get far enough away in the 20th century, you no longer have that personal contact. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about D&C 135. D&C 135, of course, it's going to lead to, it's going to be the result of the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. That's why I have this also character I'm not happy with. I have several of those in class. This is William Law. William Law is a member of the First Presidency. He's going to have some real issues with Joseph Smith. So back in the Joseph Smith era, he's going to have some real issues with Joseph Smith in late 1843. It's more than just plural marriage he has a problem with. He certainly has a problem with plural marriage. He also seems to feel somewhat uncomfortable with Joseph Smith introducing temple worship rituals, the endowment, things like that. He will be endowed, but seems to have a problem with it. And he also has a real problem with the teaching of the plurality of gods, as they will talk about it. The idea that mankind, that men and women can become gods and goddesses. He has a hard time with that. He has a hard time with things like the King Follett sermon. They're going to claim that God became God. Like many people before with baptisms for the dead or with D&C 76, that just goes too far for them. I'm willing to believe all these other things about Mormonism, but not that we're going to become like God. Not that God was like us. Not that marriage could be plural marriage. I'm not okay with that. And so he is going to have a real problem with it. We have multiple accounts of why he has a problem with it. He, of course, himself is just going to say it's these doctrines that are a problem. Hiram Smith is going to say before the city council in Nauvoo that the real problem started with Joseph Smith refusing to seal William Law to his wife, Jane. Apparently, again, this is according to Hiram Smith, so I mean, not anything you can prove. Apparently, William Law had committed adultery at some point and had never repented of it, hadn't told Jane about it. And Joseph Smith had said, until you confess this to your wife, there's no way that you can be sealed. And this and other reasons causes Law and many other people to apostatize. Of course, polygamy is always the easiest thing to attack. It was that way with John C. Bennett. It's that way in the Utah period of the church. And so Law is going to attack the church on those grounds. He's joined by other apostates like Chauncey Higbee. Chauncey Higbee is excommunicated for adultery. In his case, we're almost certain he committed adultery because we have the doctor's receipts on the fact that he's being treated for syphilis, which doesn't just happen to you, as you might be aware. Hopefully you're not actually aware of that. Hopefully you're never in a case where you have to wonder to yourself, do I have syphilis? But he and others, they're going to create a paper called the Nauvoo Expositor in June of 1844. And it is going to attack Mormonism over and over and over again. It's going to attack it on points of doctrine. It's going to claim the church is embezzling funds and taxes. And it's also going to pervert its explanation of plural marriage, because plural marriage is still being practiced in secret, right? You can't practice it openly. Most of the church hasn't been taught it yet. Most members outside of Nauvoo and even in Nauvoo don't even know about it. It's being taught in secret, but these secrets are being exposed. It might be something similar to today. There are occasionally anti-Mormons who will talk to people who haven't yet gone through the temple, and they'll start telling them some of the things that happen in the temple. Well, as a Mormon who's gone through the temple, you'd say, oh man, that's totally inappropriate. This person shouldn't be saying. That's kind of what's going on here. These marriages are supposed to be secret, as is the temple ceremonies they're performing. But as these people have been excommunicated, they then turn around and begin talking about it. The worst part is that law tries to equate what's being practiced as plural marriage. He tries to equate it with spiritual wifery, that totally bastardized form of plural marriage that John C. Bennett had invented, where there was no legal requirement or obligation to one another, that it wasn't a marriage at all. It was just the ability to have sex with whoever you wanted. And so he uses that term spiritual wifery deliberately to try to gin up these negative ideas about what's going on. As a result of this, the Nauvoo City Council is going to say, well, this paper is printing slander. It's printing libel. It's printing things about people that is false. Even if you were just counting the embezzlement of tithing funds, well, that's a false statement to make. And laws back in the 19th century are very different than they are today. Again, we always just assume that laws are the same or enforced the same as they've always been, but it's not even close. Back then, there was case law that said that libelous presses could be removed or destroyed from municipalities. It had happened in other cities. In fact, in one place, in Illinois, only a few years earlier, in Alton, Illinois, there was a preacher by the name of Elijah Lovejoy. That's actually who Reverend Lovejoy on The Simpsons is named after, by the way. He set up an abolitionist newspaper in Alton. And even though Illinois was a free state, they had a great deal of commerce with Missouri and other places, and they hated abolitionists. Abolitionists were hated. Abolitionists were seen as people who are willing to send the country into a war rather than try to deal with slavery in a reasonable way. And Lovejoy starts printing this abolitionist newspaper even after the town told them not to. So they do what you always do, as we learned in Missouri. They get a mob together, they go to the print shop, they grab Lovejoy's press, and they throw it into the river. So Lovejoy gets another press. The mob reassembles, grabs that press, and throws it into the river. So he gets a third press. The mob assembles, grabs the press, and throws it in the river. So he gets a fourth press. This time they kill him. Then, for some reason, even though he's already dead, take his press and throw it in the river. Well, no one in Alton, Illinois is even charged for the murder, let alone the destruction of this press. And this is only a couple years earlier in Illinois. In Nauvoo, their charter, granted them by the state, gave them the right to remove nuisances from the town by force. And so the city council in Nauvoo made the determination that here's all this other case law that says a libelous press, a press printing lies inside a municipality, we have the right to remove it. And so they order Joseph as the mayor to have the press removed. Joseph sends the police force, they take the press, and they throw it into the streets. Now, if you removed a libelous press and destroyed it, and it was found later that you were wrong, it wasn't libelous, well then you could be sued civilly for that destruction, but not criminally, right? That's why when Joseph is actually arrested over this, he's actually not arrested for the destruction of the press, because that is seen as something that, as the Mormons learned in Missouri, can be done. He's arrested for inciting a riot. So that's something you can be arrested for. And really the destruction of the expositor is the thing that leads to Joseph Smith's arrest. For months, there had been anti-Mormon tension simmering. In Nauvoo, the Mormons were causing all kinds of problems politically, economically. Joseph Smith had declared himself a candidate for president. So there are lots of reasons why tensions were at their boiling point. The governor orders Joseph Smith to surrender. Joseph Smith writes him back and says, "We don't dare come. Listen to all the threats there are against us of extermination, of murder. We can't go. Initially, they flee across the river, and the plan is to keep headed to the west. But the residents of Nauvoo, when they hear the governor is marching to Nauvoo with his troops, all they can think in their mind is the scenes of horror at Far West and Hans Mill. And so they beg Joseph to come back. Joseph, according to several accounts, says, "If my life is of no value to my friends, it's of nothing to myself." And he and Hiram make the decision to come back across the river, and they surrender themselves to the forces. Almost immediately after they are arrested and arraigned, they start playing some fast and loose tricks on him. He's initially supposed to be arraigned on the charge of inciting a riot. He feels like he's pretty confident about this. There is no riot. The police force went and destroyed the Nauvoo expositor, so that's not a riot. In fact, it's the police doing it. But he posts bail for this, and almost immediately after he posts bail, he is rearrested, this time on the charge of treason. Why treason? Well, treason's a non-bailable offense. You can't get out of jail on a treason charge, and it carries with it a death sentence. The argument of treason was that he had used the Nauvoo Legion to go destroy the press, which of course he didn't, but that's the argument that's made by those who were attacking him, those who were filing the charges. And so he and others are then arrested and incarcerated in Carthage jail. In Carthage jail, a mob, as you know, will attack. Joseph, earlier in the day, one of his visitors, Cyrus Wheelock, had come and offered if anyone wanted to have a pistol to defend themselves once they realized that this mob was kind of gathering. The governor had pledged that he would stay there and guarantee Joseph Smith's safety personally with the entire militia of the state of Illinois if it has to. And then on the morning of June 27th, instead of staying there and defending Joseph, marched his militia off to Nauvoo because he thought the real threat was the Mormons. He went and confiscated all of the state arms from the Nauvoo Legion, and it's while he's gone that the mob that had been gathering made an assault upon the jail. This image that I have is actually very inaccurate. Surprise, surprise, inaccurate image. Because it shows the mobbers pushing the door open, actually shooting. That never actually happens. They initially try to come in the door. The men are pressing their shoulders against it. They can't open the door, and so they think the door is locked, so they shoot through the keyhole to break the lock. And right as they do that, the men jump back from the door, and shots start coming through the door. And one of them hits Hiram Smith in the face, right on the side of his nose, and he falls, saying, "I'm a dead man." Joseph, once he realizes that they mean business, this isn't a tarring and feathering, this is murder. Joseph takes this pistol that's been given to him earlier in the day, and he opens the door very slightly, puts the gun out, and shoots blindly into the hallway. Unfortunately, they're just beginning to have 6-shooters, revolvers, and only 3 of the barrels fire. And it does hit some of the people that are in the hallway. But after that, both Willard Richards and John Taylor are going to credit Joseph Smith using that gun to defend them in Carthage jail with saving their lives. Because the easiest way to kill 4 people in a room is to walk into the room and shoot them. So why don't they do that? Well, they don't do it because they're such cowards. And John Taylor even comments on this in his account, that they're such cowards that once they think someone in the room has a gun, they won't open the door. Instead, they just start putting their guns around the door jamb and shooting blindly into the room because they're willing to murder in cold blood, these men with children and families at home. But they're not willing to risk themselves over it. So they never actually come into the room. John Taylor will marvel in one of his accounts. He'll say, "I expected them at every moment to just rush into the room, but their extreme cowardice kept them out." So sometimes people will say, "Can you believe Joseph Smith had a gun in Carthage jail?" For me, this is one of the easier things of all things in church history to handle. I just can't feel sorry for people in that hallway who are trying to murder these men, who had already murdered Hiram Smith. That Joseph, who's been commanded by God to defend themselves even unto bloodshed, right? that he uses that gun. John Taylor, realizing that they have no more bullets and expecting the mob to come through, will try to jump through the window or jump out the window. It is a 2-story building, but he figures I've got a better chance down on the ground, than I do here. And as he tries to, he's shot several times. He crawls under the bed. Joseph afterwards also tries to do the same thing. He's shot dead in the attempt, according to Willard Richards. Actually, some discrepancy on when Joseph is killed because different witnesses give different accounts. But suddenly, the founder of Mormonism is dead. John Taylor writes about how dull and lonely and sickening the feeling was that Joseph was gone. Their prophet, their leader, their general, their friend was gone. And many people thought that would end Mormonism. And you get some of that sentiment expressed in D&C 135. D&C 135 was initially printed essentially as an appendix to the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants, and it was unattributed. Later, in the 1920s, someone attributed it to John Taylor. You'll notice in the 2013 edition of the Scriptures, we no longer attribute it to John Taylor. John Taylor actually quote from D&C 135 multiple times in his life and will never say, I wrote this. So we're not entirely sure who wrote it. It was printed in the Times and Seasons shortly after the murder and then added to the Doctrine and Covenants. So maybe John Taylor had a lot to do with it. Willard Richards might have had a lot to do with it. In any case, it's canonized and it's a part of our Scripture now. That Joseph has done more, save Jesus only for the salvation of men in this world. Sometimes people accuse us of worshiping Joseph Smith. Of course, we don't worship Joseph Smith. But the reality is, everything that we believe, everything that is central to who we are as Mormons, all those radical doctrines that make us not very Christian, but make us who we are, eternal families, pre-existent life, the belief in multiple kingdoms, baptisms for the dead, marriages for each other, all of those things come from Joseph Smith. And so, while we know that he's just a man, as John Taylor talks about him, says, he was a man, he had his foibles like other men, but if he was any better, he wouldn't have been fit to live with his people. Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and as D&C 135 said, sealed his testimony with his blood. That is a powerful testimony to what they believe this Book of Mormon and this church is, that they are willing to die for these things. After Joseph's murder, mob violence subsides for a little bit, but then it becomes even worse. They begin attacking and burning Mormon settlements. The charter of the city of Nauvoo is revoked, and therefore they no longer have any legal ability to defend themselves. The decision is made. Joseph had already made it, but the decision is made to carry out Joseph's ideas and to move somewhere to the Rocky Mountains, to get away, to leave the United States. At the time, that portion of the United States, it doesn't exist. It's part of Mexico. The idea is to leave the country, to go somewhere else. And it's on that trek west that D&C 136 is received. And this reference, this reminder to the saints who have once again leaving everything they've worked for, this beautiful city, the place that they are now abandoning in favor of nothingness, right? Moving to a desert that no one else is willing to live in. I oftentimes get in trouble with some students from Utah because Brigham Young is deliberately looking for a place that no one else lives and that no one else wants to live. In fact, Sam Brannon, he leads the Saints around the Cape, and they land in what's today San Francisco. He's desperately trying to convince Brigham Young to not settle in Salt Lake. He's like, keep coming. Have you seen California? It's like beautiful. There's like water here. There's an ocean. Like the temperature's not awful. It's not a desert. And Brigham Young refuses. Says, if we were to go there, in a short time, we'd be flooded out by other settlers. They were deliberately looking for a place where no one else wanted to live. So as much as you might love Utah, we're here because Brigham Young wanted to be somewhere where no one else wanted to live. But to make you feel better, even then, he still kept going right on through Wyoming. I want to be a place where people don't want to live, but better than this, right? Apologize if you're from Wyoming. Hey, what are you going to do? Luckily, though, probably none of you are, because just statistically, almost no one's from This revelation, as you kind of talk about in your digital dialogue, demonstrates that revelations can be received from people that aren't Joseph Smith. This is Brigham Young dictating a revelation from God. And part of what God wants to tell them as they're going through this suffering, my people must be tried in all things that they may be prepared to receive the glory that I have for them, even the glory of Zion. And he that will not bear chastisement is not worthy of my kingdom. Remember, when things seem really, really, really hard, we're not talking about salvation. We're talking about exaltation. We're talking about becoming like God. If this was just about going to heaven, we don't need to worry about it. You're already going to heaven. We're talking about going to the highest heaven. The highest heaven requires sacrifice and a humility that says, I don't know why God is causing this to happen or asking me to live maybe this plural marriage commandment. But it doesn't matter why. I'm going to do what God commands me to do. And that's the faith that these people have. Let him that is ignorant learn wisdom by humbling himself and calling upon his God. That his eyes may be open, that he may see, that his ears may be open, that he may hear. For my spirit is sent forth into the world to enlighten the humble and the contrite, and to the condemnation of the ungodly. One of the things that's really difficult is that at least at some part of our faith and our belief has to be what the world mocks as a blind faith, right? We don't have the answers to everything. I don't have the answers to everything. Someone who claims they have the answers to everything is probably trying to sell you a car, right? A pretty bad one, right? I mean, the reality is we don't have the answers to everything. I don't know why some things work. I don't have an explanation. And it's believing in the face of not having a perfect explanation that separates someone who has faith and someone who's just trying to logically make their way to heaven. It's hard. Look, I've gone to get the highest level of education I can get. My life revolves around having proof and evidence and documents to make the arguments that I make. And yet, ultimately, being a Christian means believing something that is not provable. Right? It's so funny. People want to have you explain to me exactly why polygamy works, because I don't really agree with. But that same person can't explain to you the resurrection of Christ. Explain to me the resurrection. Not what happened. Oh, yes, he came. No. How did that happen? Well, the power of God. Okay, how? You don't really have an explanation. I'm always fascinated by Christians who absolutely believe Jesus is their Savior, but believe the idea that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon is the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard. Right? Take Jesus walking on water, right? Jesus walks on water. It's a powerful miracle. How could I prove that that happened? If I were to take the entire campus at BYU and march them into Utah Lake, well, there's enough carp in Utah Lake. Maybe they could walk on that, but all of them would sink. None of them would walk on water. We could march the whole country into the Pacific Ocean. Not one person would walk on water. You could march all 8 billion people in the world into the ocean, and not one of them would walk on water. Would that prove that Jesus didn't walk on water? No, because Jesus walked on water by the power of God. Miracles occur by the power of God, which means to be a Christian, the moment you say you believe in Christ, you believe in something that you cannot physically, logically prove. You don't believe that Jesus walked on water because you can prove it. You believe it because it's true. Because the Spirit tells you that it's true. I know that Jesus is my Savior not because I can prove it, but because God told me that He's my Savior. And someone can say, well, I don't think so. That's fine. That's their opinion. I know that God has told me that Jesus is my Savior. By His name I'm going to be saved. That Jesus lives, that Joseph Smith's a prophet. So part of what you have in D&C 136 verse 34 is this, kind of reticence as they're leaving the nation. Thy brethren have rejected you and your testimony, even the nation that has driven you out. They believe they're headed to another country. They're headed to Mexico, an unoccupied portion of Mexico, hoping to find in Mexico a freedom of living their religion that they couldn't find in the vaunted Bill of Rights in the United States. Now, as it happens, when they get out to Utah, they once they settle there, American imperialism catches up with them as fast as they can run from it. The Mexican War breaks out. That portion of Mexico is then ceded to the United States, and as soon as they get out of the United States, they find themselves back inside the United States. And the persecutions then at the governmental level continue, and they go on for years. But D&C 136 is really key in this, reminding us, right, that life is going to have suffering. But that's how we're headed toward exaltation. So the fact that things don't seem easy, the fact that you don't understand everything, the fact that we're ignorant of something is not evidence that they're not true. If you believe you're going to get to the point where you can understand and explain every single thing that's ever happened, every doctrine of the church, every point of history, well, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Because for some crazy reason, God still expects us to rely, at least in part, on faith. We can learn a lot about a lot of things. I can tell you all about every source we have on early plural marriage. But that doesn't tell you that it was a commandment from God. God has to tell you that it was a commandment from God. That D&C 132 was actually a revelation that Joseph Smith received. Learning facts about a thing isn't the same thing as getting a testimony of it. They can help us understand it. And certainly you don't want people to lose their testimony simply because they don't understand something, right? As I've said before in this class, we have a tendency to mistake not knowing about a thing or not understanding a thing with that thing being wrong, right? So we hear that Joseph Smith, had multiple seer stones to translate the Book of Mormon, and we've never heard of that before. And so we have a faith crisis, not because it's hard for us to understand the idea of God having his prophets use tools like Moses putting up a brazen serpent in the wilderness, or God writing on the walls of Nebuchadnezzar's court, or the Liahona being found outside of Lehi's tent. No one's having a faith crisis over the Liahona. In fact, they're quoting it in their talks they give at church. So it's not that we can't comprehend God using a physical device. It's that we hadn't heard about it before. And in some ways, it's similar with Joseph Smith's plural marriage or with the ideas of becoming like God. They're new to us. They're hard to understand. And so because of that, we can be confused into thinking that not understanding or something being new is the same thing as that thing not being true. And that is just not the case. Truth is truth. Things can be true aside from our understanding of them. We know there are true things that we don't know. We know that God will yet reveal many great and important things, which means there are true things that we don't know. So you're never going to know everything. It's important, though, to rely on the things that you do know, that you have a testimony of. Because someone antagonistically will tell you, if you don't understand everything, then all of it's false. That's just not even true. Even in the world of science, it's not true. The reality is we rely upon the things we do understand, and then we hope to someday have enough knowledge to understand the things that we don't.